have kind of Bitcoin, this hard money, tangible asset that lives in cyberspace, as Michael Saylor would say, being grafted into a global financial system that is essentially a Byzantine mess of local equity markets, derivatives markets, different sort of institutional investors with different mandates. And so the business model, if I was like being charitable, essentially is to basically be like prospectors to go essentially harvest those little pockets of trapped capital around the world. They're all just market participants, right? They're collective beliefs about other people's collective beliefs. And that's how prices get made in a market. And so there's always people that can try to, wish that away. There's people who will try to arbitrage it. And that collective belief can be monetized, right? And that's real money.
Welcome back to the Bitcoin Policy Hour, a weekly podcast hosted by the Bitcoin Policy Institute. I'm your host, Zach Cohen, associate with BPI, joined here weekly by my colleagues, Matthew Pines, BPI's executive director, and Zach Shapiro, BPI's head of policy. As with the weeks before, going to shill the Bitcoin Policy Summit again here. We've just confirmed a great group of speakers, including 3 U.S. senators, 2 members of the House of Representatives, and very happy to announce, this is actually a forward announcement, Hester Pierce, Purse of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So already got a great lineup. I think, we're still more than 6 weeks out, so more to come on that. But tickets are extremely limited. We're expecting to sell out. Grab your ticket today by visiting btcpolicysummit.org and use code BTCPolicyHour 21. All right. We're going to kind of continue on with the rapid fire approach here this week. Try to keep things a little snappier for everyone listening. So first topic we're going to dig into is Matt Pines over here has been tweeting about a newly coined Riyadh Accord. We've got some leaders, folks with a lot of influence in Riyadh this week. So Pines, what's going on in Riyadh? What are you looking out for there?
Yeah, the Mar-a-Lago Accord was getting stale, so we had to, mix it up here. I just every few weeks we're just gonna pick a new capital city to put after Accord, and the Twitters will go viral here. So there's a lot going on in the world. To state things simply, and I think while everyone was focused on Liberation Day and the tariff brouhaha and asset prices sort of whipsawing, the geopolitical reordering that was telegraphed by the administration last year, was never paused. In fact, you could make the case that the uncertainty that was unleashed kind of accelerated a lot of negotiations that were already kind of being seeded, coming into the new administration. And I don't want to kind of give the full kind of devils in the details play by play, but I noted just like the amount of people that are all gathering in one major city in the Middle East, representing a confluence of the different kind of strategic dynamics at play, right? So essentially what you have is an increasingly multipolar system, where the U.S. is not in the position of, hegemonic rule giver, but sort of, the potentially the largest bargaining position at the table, but has to make deals. And so these deals span kind of an integrated bundle now of things that are increasingly being brought together that span tech, specifically AI, security provision or security withholding, arms sales and defense agreements, and geopolitical alignments, squashing of various beefs, trade corridors, free trade agreements, embargoes or lack thereof, and monetary shifts, right? Where are sovereigns holding their reserve assets? And then the shifting diplomatic relations that are choreographing all of those changes. Right, so all of these dynamics are taking place in the context of Donald Trump's, ideological objective, which is to build a bit more of an explicit club and offense for American power and American security and economic interests. And so he seems very willing to use all these different levers to kind of secure a bargain for himself. And he makes no compunction about weaponizing to a certain extent the extraterritorial power of U.S. law in order to either provide inducements or coercion. And so I'll double down on the AI component of this in particular, because I think this is one of the more emerging kind of tools in the toolbox here that is increasingly strategic, and that hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars, are being thrown around as part of these deals that were just announced in Riyadh, where you had Jensen Huang there, you had Elon Musk there, you had Sam Altman there, as well as the major private equity honchos, Steve Schwarzman, the head of Citibank, Larry Fink, as well as, of course, the typical kind of geopolitical kind of leadership from the Gulf countries. So there's a lot of kind of integrative deal making that seems to be in play. The upshot of which is the U.S. Trying to pull the Gulf into its orbit without, and especially into its economic, tech, and trade orbit, while at the same time removing its sort of security entanglements, right? So you can see this kind of juxtaposition between a report that the New York Times just released about how apparently the Houthis almost shot down an F-35, right? And that our aircraft carriers had to take evasive maneuvers, and we lost a few fighter jets into the Red Sea. Not exactly what like a hegemonic military power is made of when it's having to dodge essentially like a de facto sort of rebel army in the Horn of the Arabian Peninsula. Doesn't exactly scream deterrence to China and Taiwan, while at the same time we are relaxing the AI export controls that had been in place that were restricting the ability of a lot of Middle Eastern countries to get access to our frontier technology in AI, right? So it turns out maybe our F-35s ain't what they used to be or what we think they are, but what we really do have, kind of the ace in the hole, is the ability to kind of restrain or restrict access to NVIDIA's GPUs, which is seen by more of these countries as essentially the strategic resource that they need to accumulate. And so there was a story last week about how the Trump administration is rescinding the AI diffusion rule, which was issued at the closing hours of the Biden administration, which essentially set up kind of a geopolitical tiered system for who would be able to get access to essentially AI compute. And the Middle Eastern countries, specifically the Emirates and the Saudis, were kind of essentially in like the yellow zone. There was a lot of conditions placed on the ability to access GPUs. The Commerce Department essentially would have to grant licenses to them. And that certainly rubbed the Emirates and the Saudis in particular the wrong way. The Trump administration ripped that rule up and just announced essentially massive deals where now the Saudis are going to get a huge amount of the latest generation of Blackwell chips, their server racks built in their country here. So clearly we're sort of wielding the sort of bundle of things that we can offer here in terms of our frontier AI models, security, not protection, but we're just going to sell you our THAAD, terminal high altitude air defense systems. We're going to sell them some drones systems. We're going to sell them more integrated sort of ISR systems, so that effectively the U.S. can kind of pull out of the Middle East and give kind of the Gulf countries as sufficiently advanced technologies as like an air defense and ISR mesh, so they can keep each other in check without having to have too much military entanglements of the U.S. explicitly in the region. At least that's the idea. While at the same time trying to pull the Middle East more into our sort of trade orbit, not just on liquid natural gas and petrochemicals, but further up the value chain there in our technology stack, right, through the AI chips that we control. And we paired that sort of rescission of the AI diffusion rule with a new export restriction on all of Huawei's Ascend chips. This was just done a few hours ago, so it hasn't been broadly reported. That essentially the Bureau of Information Security, part of the Commerce Department, can issue rules that, just like Bank Secrecy Act, kind of extraterritorialization of our legal system, essentially take the position that any piece of technology that uses American IP, American technology as part of its supply chain, can be restricted from sale under this sort of foreign direct sort of product rule. And they just slapped this on Huawei's sort of leading edge AI chip, the Ascend chip, which Huawei wants to compete against NVIDIA and in these countries especially that were otherwise going to be restricted from getting access to such leading edge chips from the diffusion rule, and potentially get China into those countries and help those countries build out an AI stack that's more aligned with the Chinese supply chain and the Chinese vision of sort of AI techno governance. So this is clearly a big play to like try to box China out of the Middle East, steer all the Middle Eastern capital, back into the United States for domestic investment to help subsidize, these grand techno-industrial investment projects that Trump has put on the roadmap, but the U.S. government itself can't really finance, right? As we've talked about, like we are in a massive debt hole, and there's not a whole lot of surpluses to go around. So we need those Middle Eastern surpluses to help essentially make good on these techno-industrial promises that Trump has made, and at the same time kind of pull them into our geoeconomic and our sort of technological orbit here. Now I don't know if Bitcoin is part of that mix. I sort of heard whispers that it's certainly on the mind of these same individuals that are doing these big deals. And so this seems to be a lot is up in the air when it comes to grand bargains, really, from Eastern Europe to the Middle East to Asia. I'll pause there, but I just I think the Mar-a-Lago Accord was fundamentally like a currency accord. It was very much focused on swaps and devaluation and kind of moving things out on the curve in terms of extending out our treasury issuance using essentially other sovereign balance sheets. This is a much more multifaceted set of deals: tech, trade, tariff, security, and monetary deals, all kind of as a bundle. And yeah, I'm really paying attention to that.
Yeah, I think the thing I want to dig into here more is the sort of middle power element here, right? It's needless to say at this point, right? There's the tension that's going on between the United States and China, and so the Middle East has sort of become identified as the center of that, or the one who might decide kind of who comes out on top to some extent. And I think the really interesting sort of foregrounding here, Pines, you were in the Middle East in December or whatever it was for the Bitcoin MENA conference, right? And there was rumblings that whole time that a lot of those countries had been buying Bitcoin, and I don't know that we've gotten a definitive answer about whether they have been or not, but as we see the kind of geopolitical rumblings start to center around that portion of the world, right? I think there's some signal there that they were talking about buying Bitcoin in December. It's May now, and they might end up being at the center of this whole thing. So I think increasingly, right, the probability that Bitcoin sort of finds itself in the middle of these geopolitical sort of reorderings, right, has
Yeah.
only gone up.
No, I'll toss over to Zach, but the last point I have, and this is David Sachs, the AI and crypto czar. He's been one of the guys sort of leading the on the ground sort of preparatory meetings with the relevant Gulf officials securing these deals. And at the same time, you have like Emirati sovereign wealth funds not only buying up their own equity positions in Bitcoin ETFs, but also doing co-investments with War Limited Financial. As well as the fact that Tether and Binance have massive operations and penetration in the Middle East, and so these are all like a tight bundle of sort of integrated emerging technologies that are now sort of being parlayed by geopolitical actors to serve a wide variety of different purposes. And I think this is just a reconfiguration of kind of the rules of the road. And there's it remains to be seen how far this will go, but it's very clear that AI and crypto like were put into one person's portfolio at the beginning of the Trump administration, and both of those issues are tightly wound up in these geopolitical dynamics in the Middle East in particular.
I think sort of one lens zooming out to sort of contextualize all of this is sort of the emerging paradigm of the 21st century. There's been a lot of talk, especially since the beginning of this presidential administration, about the end of the World War II order, which lasted from 1945 until now-ish. And the question is what does this look like going forward. And part of this is a technological story, of which obviously AI and Bitcoin are going to be a large part. Remains to be seen whether biotech is also a big part of this, or quantum computing, or other emerging technologies. But just like things like nuclear energy and globalization drove the sort of technology and economics of the last century, there is sort of a new story that's slowly coming into focus. And then there's a geopolitical element which intersects with the economic and technological elements. And where are the sources of powers going to be? Are the sea lanes going to be as important as they were in the post-World War II era? How important is capital and energy going to be, especially on I guess, both the AI and Bitcoin side of the equation? And it's interesting to see. I think it's probably too early to have an overall picture or really even understand the narrative as it's developing, but it's a little bit like you have this fuzzy Polaroid of this new world that's being birthed, that is going to be more multipolar and more dependent on AI and Bitcoin, and it's sort of slowly coming into focus. And when you have events like this, it's the resolution becoming a little bit clearer of who the players and what the relevant technologies and economic trends will be.
One thing to be aware of, just on this point, in my previous life, when I was doing geopolitical cyber risk consulting, I engaged with some of the frontier AI labs as well as other related big tech companies, and it was known, this was 2023, that a major bottleneck for their vision of the success of the technology was going to be U.S. domestic energy production. And so that's when these conversations started happening with the Middle East, because the two things the Middle East has in abundance is surplus capital, permissive regulatory environment, and lots of energy resources. Mm-hmm. And so if you have a vision of this kind of 10x, 10x, 10x for what it's going to take to train, especially the next generation of frontier models, and you're looking at the US domestic grid and our energy system, and you realize that you're going to hit that ceiling pretty quickly, you have a strong incentive to try to find partnerships to keep that growth curve up. And I think what we're seeing today in Riyadh is a manifestation of that sort of long-running path. And these deals, you could view through the lens of almost anchored on this idea of AGI. Like, where is AGI going to be born? Is it going to be born in a data center in, flyover country America that's been connected into a bunch of different SMRs and sort of nat gas power plants? Or is it going to be in the Emirati or the Saudi desert? And from the perspective, I think, of some, AI lab leadership, if you worry about the U.S. government kind of cracking down on your AGI lab or sending agents in and taking the keys away, maybe you want to have a backup plan, or maybe your primary plan is to eventually shift over. The next big run isn't going to be done in the U.S. The big run, the mega run, the AGI run, your plan is to have that be run somewhere in the Middle East in 2028. And so there's that dynamic at play here, which is concerning from a certain perspective of like, okay, well, if we do think there are risks associated with doing that, and if we are also concerned that whoever's in control of that AGI, breakthrough capability is going to be a kind of a cohort / cabal of Emirati and Saudi sovereign wealth funds that report to two autocratic leaders in a business deals with a handful of tech oligarchs, and they're kind of out of the reach of sort of democratic accountability. That's a concern to keep an eye out. So speaking just frankly from the perspective of where this technology is going and where it's physically going to be developed, that's, I think, a major dynamic. And I think from a hard realist perspective, I think that's what you would expect, right? You would expect these sorts of systems to find their most permissive environment to develop. We're a few years away from that, I think, but I think it changes the geopolitics of all of this. Like there was debates that we were having a few years ago about whether this would be a backdoor for China to sort of get access to AGI, and whether these Middle Eastern sort of entrepôts would be kind of a halfway house for, and they might still be a kind of a way of essentially diffusing what could otherwise be a ratchet. We've talked about this before in an AI 2027 conversation, is that if it feels like China thinks that the US might be getting the jump, or if the US feels like China may be getting the jump, well, then we're in this kind of security technology race, and a whole bunch of security dilemmas come into play, where maybe I'll actually take a pretty aggressive move to try to like stop your progress if I feel like you're about to get out of reach. One potential solution to that is to sort of build the AGI in kind of like the Switzerland, right, where kind of sort of everyone kind of get access to it, but also nobody can kind of centrally control it. Like, you wouldn't really expect the Emirates or the Saudis to be able to like fully control it per se. But that's like you can imagine that would be like a scenario where, okay, we know we'll eventually have to do kind of a bit of an arrangement where China gets a piece of the action here. I don't know. This is more speculation. But this is the context for these big rearrangements taking place. I know we talk a lot on the monetary dynamics, but I think what's driving a lot of these folks now is we need to get trillions of dollars. We need cheap energy. And we need to like have like a handful of people just like write the rules.
Yeah. Okay. We'll touch back on this next week. I think we'll definitely know more as the weeks go on. But interesting, definitely, to see everybody kind of in one place, probably talking about the same thing. So thank you, Pines, for for bringing that to everyone's attention. Speaking of bringing attention to things, Zach, you've been on the circuit talking about Samourai a lot. We briefly touched on the update last week, but I know that there's been another update this week. So can you clue us in on that? Kind of let us know what the avenue or the road forward looks like.
Yeah, I think two updates since we last spoke. So I think on the last episode we talked about the judge having ordered the prosecutors to respond to the defense's letter about this revelation that they'd been withholding for a full year of the case, and then 6 months before the fact that, despite the fact that they are charging the defendants here with failing to register as a money transmitter with FinCEN, they had previously gone to FinCEN, who told them that the defendants here were not money transmitters under the Treasury Department's view of what that term means. The government responded on Friday and said, for any number of reasons, that they think that this request is moot and is not a big deal, and they don't even need to have a conversation in front of the judge, that this was just a informal conversation between them and a couple of FinCEN employees in their personal capacity, and didn't reflect the view of FinCEN, that the sort of revelation here was only relevant to one of the charges, which was redundant with the other two. So the defendants here are also charged with conspiracy to commit money laundering, which, according to the government, is much more about the defendant's intent to help criminals launder money than it is about whether or not their non-custodial tool constituted money transmission. And then even with the money transmission charge, they split that up into two specific violations. One, they admit this revelation is relevant, which is a violation of the Bank Secrecy Act. But the other is a separate criminal statute called Section 1960, which, in addition to the sort of standard money transmitting language, makes it a crime to not register as a money transmitter when you knowingly transfer funds that you know belong to criminals. The defense responded this Monday, which I guess is now yesterday, basically calling the government out here. First of all, the main question is, who was it that transmitted the funds? And that is directly this question under the FinCEN 2019 guidance about, in the case of non-custodial technology, where people are moving funds with their own keys, whether they are transmitting the funds, which seems to be the more logical way to think about this, or whether it is permissible for the government to hold software developers that created software that the users use to transmit their funds responsible, as if the software developers had transmitted the funds themselves. They show that the government understands that this was ambiguous, and that is not something that is permitted when you bring criminal charges. There's the rule of lenity. There is a requirement of the Constitution that you have adequate notice, and none of this is possible when the government is taking a, at best, ambiguous statute and twisting it in a novel way, and then basically creating new regulation through criminal prosecution, and then sort of saying, like, the idea that you went to the senior officials at FinCEN and you asked them about this case and you gave them all the facts and they explained what the FinCEN guidance meant, that you could possibly characterize that as a personal conversation with two employees at FinCEN that didn't have anything to do with FinCEN's view is just sort of ridiculous. So we're now waiting for the judge to respond, and we'll see if the judge is going to order a hearing or not. And meanwhile, there's still an effort underway to bring this to the attention of the administration that, as we just talked about, has a lot of things going on, but really ought to pay attention to this because it is upstream of a lot of what they want to happen with Bitcoin and crypto in the United States.
So Zach, is the SDNY just spitting in the face of main justice here? Are they spitting in the face of their colleagues at FinCEN? Are they just sort of trampling on a basic principle of justice here? Like, I'm trying to see, like, take the other side of the argument here. Like, is there something I'm missing?
Yeah, at this point, I don't think there's any way to understand what's happening with the Southern District other than they are spitting in the face of main justice, and specifically Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, who wrote a memo on April 7th that in very clear terms explained that the DOJ would no longer do Biden-era prosecution, regulation by prosecution, and would specifically not do that under Section 1960, and specifically would not do that with mixing or tumbling tools. It seems like the memo was directly about the Tornado Cash case and the Samourai wallet case. And so I think even just continuing these cases is clear evidence of insubordination by federal prosecutors who are bringing a type of case that is much more fitting with the prior administration's overtly hostile and antagonistic view of the Bitcoin and crypto industry than it is of President Trump's stated desire, stated in his executive order, to make America the Bitcoin superpower and the crypto capital of the world. You can't both have America be the crypto capital of the world and throw crypto developers in jail for making the tools that crypto users use. And so it really is sort of remarkable that this is allowed to go on, especially in light of this pretty blatant prosecutorial misconduct that came to light last week.
Sorry, Zach C. I just want to continue the Socratic dialogue here because I also have been listening to lots of, crypto Bitcoin podcasts and following Bitcoin crypto Twitter the last few weeks. And I've noticed, say a general distribution of attention being paid mostly to like Genius Act and stablecoin legislation relative to this particular topic. And I don't know if I had to step back and consider like the relative significance of these different issues, it seems like what you're talking about is vastly more significant to what we think the future of crypto is in this country than a particular piece of stablecoin legislation. Am I wrong there? Is the policy ecosystem not necessarily oriented towards the right priorities here?
Yeah, they're not weighting these the right way. So we wouldn't be doing a good job as the Bitcoin Policy Institute if we didn't separate out Bitcoin and crypto. But if we take each of those in turn, what is the most important thing to understand about Bitcoin for Bitcoin policy? It's that Bitcoin is this amazing instance of digital capital that has all of the attributes of a gold-like money, but is digital and can therefore be the foundation of a new monetary system and monetary policy and international trade. But what is it specifically that makes Bitcoin, as opposed to any of the attempts before it or any of the other crypto assets, what makes Bitcoin a good asset and good capital? It is specifically Bitcoin's credible scarcity. It is the fact that the Bitcoin network is truly decentralized, that we learn from the block size wars that there isn't a concentrated power, even if you take all of the exchanges and the VCs and the miners and they try and make a modest change, they can't do it. That's really what enforces 21 million. However, if the government can basically order changes to the way the Bitcoin network works by treating everyone as a money transmitter, forcing miners to add the ability to KYC, forcing non-custodial devs to do that, and really undermining the ability of people to use the Bitcoin network, that makes it harder to use Bitcoin as money. And that is upstream of Bitcoin's sort of bullish attributes as an asset that are really important to the promise that Bitcoin has to fulfill. And then if you look at the rest of crypto, if crypto has any value over the traditional financial system, it's the ability to disintermediate the traditional financial players. It is the idea that you used to need an investment bank or player to market make, and now you can use a smart contract called an automated market maker to create a market between two assets just based on code. You used to need a brokerage to be able to trade between various assets. Now you can have a bunch of smart contracts that create a decentralized exchange that allow people to swap one token for another. And hopefully those tokens will eventually represent real estate and equity and all the things that we want to move on chain. It's the idea that it used to be that you needed to form a Delaware C Corp to bring people and capital together to accomplish goals and projects. And now through game theory and cryptography, you can use a DAO to create a treasury and have voting tokens that allow people to coordinate each other on a peer-to-peer basis. And if the law doesn't understand that in each of these cases, both with the transfer of Bitcoin and then with all of these different potential applications of blockchain and crypto, if the law doesn't understand that these are in fact peer-to-peer, which just as a factual matter is what's going on, and instead it wishes there was a financial institution that it could regulate, and it fills that hole in its heart by throwing developers in prison, this whole thing ultimately is not going to work, or at the very least, it's not going to work in America, and it's going to be way harder and slow down the timeline.
Last Socratic question here. So we've talked about number go up and freedom go up, but I think to be more specific here, like you're telling me that even in an environment where we have a White House that is stacked with Bitcoiners that says they want to accumulate Bitcoin as a strategic asset, that a handful of court cases, maybe one or two, could lead to decisive and very bad opinions that could fundamentally or maybe even fatally compromise the core value proposition and ethos of this whole thing. Am I being too apocalyptic here?
No, I mean, I think that those are very clearly the stakes, and the challenge here is that this is a little bit of a nuanced question. It is one thing to understand that in some level that Bitcoin is digital gold and that crypto is more efficient rails for moving dollars and assets around. It is another thing to dig deep enough to understand at a granular level how that happens. And then it is another level to dig down and understand exactly how the technology works and what the difference is between custodial and non-custodial applications of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And then yet another thing to understand the Bank Secrecy Act, our sort of current financial regulations, and how all of these things intersect with each other. And so, yes, I don't necessarily blame the folks in power here, but this is a critically important education mission, because I think if it were fully and adequately explained to the policymakers, at least at the top of the executive branch right now, this should be a 5-alarm fire and absolutely, the top, or at least one of the very top priorities that they should be focused on if they want to accomplish all of the other goals that they seem to be making, substantial progress on and devoting substantial resources to.
Sorry, Zexy. One more thing. And how many people, obviously BPI and yourself were very much focused on this and working to support the amicus briefs, etc. Could you just count up how many people do you think like us and like you are in the trenches trying to fight this fight?
In terms of lawyers who are really focused on this issue, there are probably 5 of us. There are, 3 or 4 policy organizations in the world that are taking this seriously, and it's just not nearly enough. And so, this is once again my plea for people to just do a little bit of digging here and take this seriously, because it's not something, it's like Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is counterintuitive. It seems like a Ponzi scheme. It seems like it's not backed by anything. And then if you do just enough digging, it really makes sense. And the same is true of this particular issue. It sounds really in the weeds and legalistic, but it's actually at its root, it's a conceptual problem of, when the law presumes an intermediary and there is no intermediary, what happens? And is it appropriate to hold developers responsible for the actions of the people who use their software?
Riverside is facilitating this verbal transaction. And so if we exchange anything of value, they're a money services business.
Well, actually, it's the dinosaurs who died to create the energy that's being burned to power the laptops in the Riverside application that really should be KYCing us all right now.
It's really the AGI in the far future conformal infinity that rebooted this universe's timeline. That's who FinCEN needs to go after.
Yeah,
right,
I mean, look, for the software engineers who might be listening, this is just like a infinite regress. This is literally a glitch in the system that either we could patch with the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, or we can allow as an exploit for the Department of Justice, and particularly Biden-era prosecutors in the Department of Justice, to exploit to create an effective ban on the direct use of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency.
Okay, my turn. Pines, question for you. Do you and this is a little bit more speculative, but do you think that sort of the partisan nature of Bitcoin and crypto that's maybe sort of like a residue of the Biden administration like, is that kind of clouding maybe this particular issue? It's definitely clouding the Genius Act issue. But, is that something that we continue to deal with, even though we have a, increasingly sort of friendly administration?
It's hard to see if it's partisan because I'm not sure how much it maps, directly through, your tribe in DC. I think it maps to kind of more of like, do you view the institutional prerogatives of the current arrangement of power as being fundamentally good, and then not, and then any challenge to that arrangement of power as being inherently bad, right? And so there's a certain arrangement of power that has been established and accommodated over many years, and there's a certain system of specialized bureaucratic skill sets that have been reinforced, and then people have carved out regimes of authority within that political economic ecosystem, right? And the oversight and management of our financial system, the surveillance state that we've built around the Bank Secrecy Act, and this reconfiguration of the relationship between the individual and the state has empowered a certain subset, right? And so those people don't want to give up that power. It's not an ideological thing like D or R. I think there's some people who don't like, not having power, right? They want to have that throat to choke. It gives them status. It gives them, in a certain frame of mind, it allows them to mitigate risk, right? There are bad people in the world that if they're not surveilled, they can blow things up. And they view that as a sufficient justification to surveil everyone. And, I think in a democracy that's corrosive and leads to pathologies, and ultimately people revolt. And so you can't just like lock people down in a panopticon and say, no, you need to ask permission from us in order to do things. And they have to pass a litmus test that we've designed. And I think there's just certain personality types that are attracted to much more authoritarian inclinations, and you see those on the right and the left, right? So I don't think it's whether you're inclined to read Rothbard or Marx. I think it's more of where do you actually see yourself in the power structure, and are you threatened by these technologies, or are you empowered by these technologies? I do think the last point is there is a partisan lens to this, because it just so happens, as a contingent matter of fact, the Democrats are the opposition party to a Republican White House that is going all in on crypto and is very much engaged in familial business practices that are aligned to the success of crypto. And so there's a very clean political argument that, we want to point at sort of the grifting and the self-dealing here as a way of essentially justifying our crackdown on open source technology. Right? It's basically would be like if there was a whole bunch of successful sort of public-private key encryption startups, right, in the 90s, and the president got involved in them, and then the opposition parties, the Republicans at the time, were like, oh no, see, like Clinton, he's getting in bed with big crypto, meaning cryptography. We need to ban cryptography because it's going to enrich the White House and his family. And it just so happens that it means that nobody's emails are secure. And that seems to be a bad faith, more political argument at the moment. I don't know.
I think I'd take it even one step further than that. I think, yes, it is a contingent fact that this is right left, and it needn't be, and it shouldn't be. And part of our work is to change that. And I do think, yes, there is some part of it that is, rather than right left, it's sort of the top and bottom of the political compass, and it's much more authoritarian versus libertarian sort of disposition that spans both parties. But I think on a long enough time frame, it's just inevitable there is going to be this kind of strong opposition just from the state as a structural matter. I think what Bitcoin does is inevitably it takes some power away from the state, the ability to surveil and censor transactions, and monetary policy, right? Power over the money supply. I think on a long enough time horizon, Bitcoin does pose a threat to both of those things, and the state just isn't going to go quietly on those because institutions don't like to give up power. And then I think when you sort of also look at this trend with AI and you think, Bitcoin and crypto more broadly, when it's married with AI, what does this allow, right? Not only there is agents that people talk about coming in the near future with AI that we talked about in our AI 2027 scenario, but now agents that can hold Bitcoin in a non-custodial way and can pay for themselves and really can be economic actors regardless of what laws you pass in the banking system. And this is coming one way or another. And I don't mean to suggest for 1 second that the right regulatory answer is to try and stop it altogether. That's not possible, and that will create bad policy. And absolutely, even if you wanted to create policy around this, the right way to do it isn't to insert the Bank Secrecy Act into a place that it doesn't logically belong and then criminally punish developers. I think there's opportunity for a democratic conversation about what these rules should be and how these rules should deal with the custodial non-custodial distinction. And again, the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, I think, is a good example of the law doing this. It is updating the Bank Secrecy Act, whatever you think of it, for a world where non-custodial tools exist and permitting that distinction that just is real. But no matter what, regardless of the current political valence around Bitcoin and crypto, this was going to be an issue we were going to face, and it is going to be an important political conversation.
Well, and I think we should draw lessons from at the AI conversation, which essentially is speed running this process of, there were debates not too long ago in sort of the AI safety and AI security community about how would we ensure AI development and access to frontier models would retain this kind of libertarian ethos of the open internet. How would we resist state capture? And that's pretty much given up. Like, it's a completely state capture. Like, there's no one like, even putting on the pretense that something like decentralized, open access, non-surveilled, not state controlled AI is going to be a possibility at this point, right?
Right, and that's also, isn't that like to some extent sort of why the like AI 2027 sort of scenario heats up to the extent that it does, right?
Yeah, I mean, look at Jensen Huang, right? Like, he's like the avatar for this, right? He knows where his bread is buttered, and he knows like the power of the state could just crush him. And so what is he going to do? He's going to buddy up to both Xi and Trump and make them equally as happy as he can, and just accommodate himself to basically their whims. And that's what's happening here, right? And then the same thing with Sam Altman, right? Like, these guys, their whole raison d'etre now is essentially to be closer to, like, instead of the money printer and sort of the Cantillon thing, it's closer to the folks that could otherwise kill their business models, or cut off their access to leading edge compute, or shut down their R&D, take over their operations, sanction them, like do all sorts of things the state can do. And this is we talked about this, I think, sometimes, is there's a certain vision that's been pushed by the Biden administration, and I think it's still surviving now in the Trump administration, of essentially KYC for compute. Although I don't think it's going to be as like technocratic as the version that the Biden administration had in mind, which is like a bunch of bureaucrats sitting inside the Commerce Department, kind of counting up flops and having all sorts of very complicated regimes. It's much more like, does Trump like you, right? Is he just gonna like shake your hand and approve the deal till you get those chips? So I think we could be heading into a world not too far away where access to intelligence is essentially a feudal relationship with a kind of a multinational kind of U.S. centered. There's be two poles, or U.S. and a China pole, and it's going to give amazing benefits, right? These models are just transformative, but effectively everyone will be in a fundamentally like a feudal relationship with respect to them. And I think, okay, like, where's like the last bastion here of something that's decentralized? It's basically Bitcoin, right? Because without that, if you didn't have Bitcoin, right, if it didn't exist, if we're just in an alternative timeline of just we've just got bank money and probably CBDCs plus this, then human autonomy is totally cooked. And so I'm optimistic because I think Bitcoin is a powerful force here, but it's gonna collide with these other forces. And I think it's going to require deftness within and outside the Bitcoin community to see how can we leverage it to its maximum potential as a foundation for more freedom technologies, right? For these other things like Xiaomi and eCash mints. How can you take advantage of these principles of cryptography to get access to frontier AI models in a pseudonymous way, right? So and then fight for regulations and policies that allow that to happen, right? Because right now you use O3. And as everyone who's had the occasion to do it is like, it's a scary, interaction, because in a certain sense it knows you, right? It can interpolate a huge amount about your personality, your interests, and it's very powerful because it has access to that, and it can sort of be an extension of your mind and your reasoning process. And it's a very powerful thing. But guess what? That's an extension of me that lives inside OpenAI servers. That is intellectual property owned by OpenAI that I have no way of monetizing or even really inspecting or controlling. It can be taken away from me or used against me at any minute.
Yeah, well, it's actually precisely for that reason I think I'd push back a little bit on the inevitability of the feudalism here. I think that's going to be
pessimistic.
Well, no. It's not that any of that's wrong, and I think everything you say holds true for the frontier models, both at the training on data and likely your relationship with the purveyors. The big tech companies are going to be the purveyors of the frontier models. But the question is, like, what will be the sort of open source long tail of AI? And so far, it lags the frontier models, but not by a generation or two, not by a ton. And at some point, it seems likely we will get to non-frontier open source models, especially if China keeps its development mostly open source, that are pretty serviceable. And I think, like, for precisely the reasons you mentioned, you get to a point where these things are not just helpful, but helpful to the point where they're indispensable, and they're going to know everything about you, and they're going to run your life, and they're going to have this incredible data, and they're going to have market power. And so, the scenario, if absent using open source models, will be they know everything about you. You need them. You can't function as a human society without them, and they can charge whatever they want. And I just watched the most recent season of Black Mirror, and there's an episode where someone has a traumatic brain injury. They go to a startup who reinstalls part of their brain, but they have to be on the subscription plan to stay alive, and they can upgrade to get the premium features to their consciousness. And I don't know how palatable that is going to be, either from just a sort of feudal relationship perspective that people will feel comfortable with, or just from a will I feel comfortable providing the data side and with whatever data security solutions. And so I think there may be a solution on the AI side where people hold their own data locally. They run their own either open source or subscription models, but there is a gate between their sort of personal weights and their personal data and the LLM that is actually working on their behalf, rather than having all the sort of memory stored on a tech company's servers. And you're actually literally holding your personal data with something like private keys, like we'd think about self-custody for Bitcoin. And I think that's sort of interesting just as a business model. Like, what is the storage of this? What's going to be incredibly sensitive data? Because think about how it can be used against you if your therapist and your business partner and it all like is just data, and it can be weaponized effortlessly against you. And we may well see the same thing with money, right? Bitcoin here is the open source money. It's the people's money. It's the one that can't be controlled, and you can hold it yourself. And it's very much like the open source AI. And then whether the alternative to that is a corporate alternative like WorldCoin, where you're at the mercy of the VCs who own a tremendous amount of the supply of WLD, and they can effectively set monetary policy and decide how much purchasing power you have in the economy, or whether it's a state-run CBDC like China's yuan. It may be that the latter is so horrible it pushes you to the former, and so too with AI open source models.
Yeah, I think it goes back to when we say decentralized compute, decentralized intelligence, decentralized money, what it comes down to is like creating bearer equivalents, right? You need to have Bitcoin is a bearer asset. A GPU rack in your office is bearer compute, right? And so this is a vision of a technological decentralized ecosystem that's requires policy to not get in the way, right? As we've seen, bearer instruments in the past have been banned, right? And so you could ban the ability of an individual to own a certain amount of flops in their house, just as much as you could ban the ability of people to self-custody digital assets, right? Maybe you could difficult to enforce such a ban, although not impossible, right? Like that thing has to connect to the internet. There might be certain ways of enforcing such a ban. So I think we should think about failure modes here, where the incentives of the existing ecosystem are quite strong to kind of centralize and to kind of squeeze out open source alternatives. And there's a technological paradigm here. We don't know how it'll evolve. Like, how much actual, hardware do you need to maintain parity with that frontier? How much test type compute and inference, do you actually need to maintain parity? And also, everyone's not going to upgrade their CPU, right? The good thing about Bitcoin is you don't need a whole lot of compute, right? You can kind of keep your Raspberry Pi running for years now, basically, right? And you just 1 TB hard drive and you're good for a long time. That's the benefit of Bitcoin. It's why it's able to kind of remain decentralized to a large extent. So yeah, I don't have like, this is again like a forecast. I'm sort of speculating here about different failure modes. But this idea of like decentralized money, decentralized intelligence, and decentralized energy, right? This is the next logical thing. Ultimately about like local versus global, right? Cloud versus self-hosted. And it seems like the trajectory we've been on, right, has been more cloud, more global, more integration. And that seems like we're moving more towards like sovereign cloud as opposed to like global, multi-cloud tenants for hyperscalers that are working in China and China. That part's fragmenting. And now it's going to more sovereign clouds, right? Sovereign, ownership of data. So the countries get this. Countries want their own full stack. Countries want their own independent sovereign energy resources, their critical inputs. They want to be as resilient as possible to global shocks. They want to have the frontier AI models and the compute in their country physically. That's what these deals with, in the Middle East are about. So if you've got the juice, you can get the NVIDIA chips. And then they want to have, independent, monetary reserves, right? They want to, diversify into gold and Bitcoin. And so I just look at, okay, the model that sovereigns like the Emirates and Saudi are following. I'm like, how can that be possible for each person, right? Every person, if it's good enough for Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, it's good enough for me and everyone else. And so that's like, okay, that's the policy kind of direction I think we want to go.
Yeah. Okay. I want to put a pin in this, but before we move on, want to kind of underscore. I think the big takeaway here from my perspective is, the Bitcoin and the decentralized currency and digital asset policy, right, is it's sort of like the first crack to some extent that we've had at ensuring sovereignty of citizens, in the United States and maybe across the world, right?
Since the Bill of Rights,
right.
That was also yeah.
Yeah. So, in hundreds of years, right? Or at least in the digital age. And so, what we're looking at now is like, if we don't get this right, there are sort of broader implications for future relationships with the government, with technology, with our relationships with one another. And so, to sort of put us in perspective here, right? Like, how we handle the next couple of years of Bitcoin policy and maybe crypto policy more broadly, right? I think, needless to say, that will have implications going forward. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, the last point I'll say is like AI is in the middle of its exponential moment, and we're seeing trillions of dollars of geopolitical deals flowing in the middle of that moment. Bitcoin is yet to have its exponential moment, despite the price run-ups. But I think when we see, and I think we will see Bitcoin having its exponential moment, those will be trillions of dollars of geopolitical capital flows that will have these sorts of questions at the core of it. So I think it behooves us to pay close attention to these dynamics now with AI, because that will be the template I think we're going to see play out when Bitcoin has its own exponential.
Yeah. Okay, great. So last topic for the day, a little bit of number go up talk, to cap things off here. This week we had the announcement of Nakamoto, which is the BTC Inc. Sort of holding company, strategy, lookalike, whatever you want to call it here. What are we looking at in terms of this sort of like corporate adoption of Bitcoin? These the increasing numbers of publicly traded equities that are allowing investors to gain access to Bitcoin's price. What are the kind of implications for that from like a policy perspective? If either of you have thoughts on that.
I'll be honest, I don't understand this business model at all. I don't know what it means to be a Bitcoin treasury company. I can absolutely understand why an operating company might want to look at its long-term liabilities and need to store value and not want to just do dividends or share buybacks and put some Bitcoin on the balance sheet. Totally get that. I also understand right now the need for sort of traditional financial wrappers around Bitcoin, like spot ETFs, because they're easier to get leverage against and they interface with the traditional financial system sort of more easily. I don't understand. I also, one more thing I think is real is we are going to need Bitcoin specific financial services. I think it's very important. We sort of have been looking a lot at the River data recently, and they published a report where they showed something like 16 million coins, not including lost coins, are held by individuals as opposed to ETFs, institutions, et cetera. And so there are a lot of, a majority of Bitcoin is in the hand of individuals. I think that number, the value of that will go up precipitously. And then a lot of these folks who are currently self-custodying are going to need some financial services, whether that is custody, inheritance services, being able to borrow against their Bitcoin, especially when they have very large unrealized capital gains, help getting mortgages, insurance, tax planning, you name it. However, the idea that if you have a large pool of Bitcoin, it allows you to, I don't know what, that raising debt and equity to add to that Bitcoin stack is a business model, is just something I guess I don't fully grok.
So what do you think led to the quantity of dollars raised for that company? Like what exactly are people buying into there?
Well, it's working now. There's a lot of interest in investing in this. It came from MicroStrategy, which started as just a company that wanted to preserve its purchasing power with Bitcoin, and then bought enough Bitcoin that it became a vehicle before the spot ETF that people could invest in, and then came up with very clever mechanisms to tap the capital markets to add to its Bitcoin stack. And there are a lot of companies that want to do that, and it's having a moment right now. And there are, our securities laws, unlike ICOs, which were just basically illegal unregistered securities offerings. I think these things provide lots of different legal mechanisms to finance the purchase of Bitcoin. I'm just curious, ultimately, like towards what end? Mm-hmm. And there's sort of lots of speculation about what all of these companies might do with their treasuries, but I have to admit I don't fully understand what.
Yeah, it seems to me it's fundamentally a meme wrapped in geographic arbitrage, wrapped in legal arbitrage, right? And you could say there's nothing there. You could also say there's like trillions of dollars in that type of memetic arbitrage. We live in kind of a postmodern, financial system. And you have kind of Bitcoin, this hard money, tangible asset that lives in cyberspace, as Michael Saylor would say, being grafted into, a global financial system that is essentially a Byzantine mess of local equity markets, derivatives markets, corporate bond markets, sovereign bond markets, different sort of institutional investors with different mandates. And so there's lots of like gradients that are sort of market or that are non-market imposed gradients in terms of capital pools and their ability to access Bitcoin. And so the business model, if I was like being charitable, essentially is to basically be like prospectors to go essentially harvest those little pockets of trapped capital around the world. And some would be big pockets. I think MicroStrategy was the first to identify, those pockets of big capital, whether it's in, the convert bond market or just the general equity market that, pre ETFs, et cetera. But there's fundamentally like a memetic component to this too, right? You kind of need to like educate the local buying pool that Bitcoin is like a cool thing that they should buy into, because part of the whole financial engineering piece of this is you need to kind of get the memetic premium for your stock to then issue the debt around to kind of create that leverage, right? Otherwise, you're just a wrapper around Bitcoin. Why should you trade at anything other than a NAV of 1? And this is fundamentally this like reflexivity that is always, it's like the internal debates about MicroStrategy. Like, where's the NAV, right? Is it a fiction? It's like, they're all just market participants, right? Mm-hmm. They're collective beliefs about other people's collective beliefs. And that's how prices get made in a market. And so there's always people that can try to, wish that away. There's people who will try to arbitrage it. And that collective belief can be monetized, right? And that's real money, right? It's not just because it's people's beliefs, like doesn't mean that it can't be generated. It can't generate a price that can be higher than the present price. And so I think, it's one of those things where, yeah, like I think it's essentially a meme wrapped in geographic arbitrage, wrapped in legal arbitrage. But but that doesn't mean it's not like gonna print money. I don't know how sustainable it is, where the equilibrium point is, what like the end game is ultimately, how it intersects, geography to geography. One of the things that I'm really interested in and will be very curious about, their business model is very different than these other ones that have gone to market like 21, is they're going country by country, right? So we already have Metaplanet, we already have, I think it's a HK 1723 in Hong Kong. I think there's going to be one in Brazil, maybe I heard rumors of something in Canada. I'm not sure if I don't think it's associated with David Bailey's entity. Maybe there'll be some in the Middle East, maybe there'll be some in South Asia. And so I'm really interested in like where they go and how successful they are as like essentially like a canary in the coal mine for Bitcoin's geopolitical adoption, right? So I think where the next Metaplanet et cetera shows up, I think it'll be a really good clue to like, well, what does that national government think about Bitcoin, right? And I think that would be like a way to kind of map out, right, kind of the dark matter of Bitcoin adoption around the world. And so just for that, I hope they go everywhere just so I can get good data. But yeah, it's fascinating to see, how it evolves. I think Bitcoiners will continue to have, interminable fights about it, and then the market will just do its thing.
Yeah. I mean, look, obviously a lot of our friends and colleagues are involved in these things. And just to be clear, absolutely wish them the best. And I hope this is all incredibly successful. But my real hope for this is that, look, these folks are in a lot of these cases able to raise a lot of capital on really favorable terms and amass large pools of Bitcoin. And then I think the question is like, then what? And I think that the sort of optimistic outcome here is that Bitcoin can be deployed to provide services to Bitcoiners and sort of make the network resilient and help support software and financial services. And these could be the seeds for some of the Bitcoin banks of the future. I think the other thing that's really critical here is for each of these to be differentiated in a way where it doesn't end up being, these companies take on a lot of debt, and then there are more and more and more of these companies until it exhausts demand. And these companies can only stay alive insofar as they can keep raising debt because there's not other operations. And that's if it goes that direction, then you worry about the type of bubble we saw with ICOs and NFTs and stuff like that. And so yeah, I'm also sort of eagerly watching what is it once the Bitcoin has been acquired and there's all this capital sitting there inside these treasuries. How is that capital productively put to work?
Yeah, and one interesting, I think that's very much like an astute assessment here, right? Like there's risk, in taking leverage on Bitcoin, right? And I think any investor, right, should go into those investments with like eyes wide open to sources of leverage and sort of martingale risk. But from a policy perspective, I'm also interested in related to my earlier point, just take the Metaplanet example. Like Metaplanet, I think was like maybe still is like the most traded equity in the Japanese stock market. So here's this like kind of come out of nowhere sort of random hotel stock that turns into a Bitcoin treasury company, becomes like a domestic meme for Bitcoin, becomes like the most liquid traded stock in their whole equity market. Policymakers pay attention to that, right? And so that raises the salience of Bitcoin in that domestic ecosystem. How does that translate into say strategic Bitcoin reserve policy by those governments? I think it's like a lot of dots. But in a lot of these other countries, right, where there's lots of other things that Bitcoin is probably not even salient to them, you can imagine like something like a Metaplanet showing up in Thailand or in Vietnam or in one of these kind of middle power kind of countries where the idea of a Bitcoin reserve or a national policy towards Bitcoin is kind of just not even on the radar. And then boom, here comes a Bitcoin company. If question mark, right? If it pulls out like a Metaplanet like type of thing, it's going to generate a lot of attention. The national policymaker is going to have to like take a look at it. And if it blows up, it's not good for Bitcoin in that country. But if it's successful, right, does it actually act as a catalyst for those countries to get involved? So very like high risk, right, in various ways. But yeah, I think it's important to kind of think about it as not just kind of this corporate treasury play, which I think is like this, for example, a separate argument. Matt Cole from Strive, they have a separate business model, but in keeping with this broader theme that we're seeing play out here of essentially acquiring lots of capital and then identifying kind of zombie companies with a lot of cash on their balance sheet that's not reflected in the valuation. So essentially, there's some companies that have like, more cash than their market value, and so you can essentially buy out the whole company for like 90 cents on the dollar, and then turn those into essentially bank holding, like into holding companies that convert that cash into Bitcoin. There's an arbitrage there. These companies are beaten down. If you get the financial engineering right and you've got the sophisticated kind of market acumen to do those acquisitions in a creative fashion, you can essentially turn 1 Bitcoin into 1.1 Bitcoin, right? And America's the land of financial engineering. That's what we specialize in. It says, all right, how do we get more Bitcoin, in American companies, right? Well, we're going to do what we do best, which is financial engineering, right? Until we do this techno-industrial renaissance, right? I think this is going to happen. But I would say, yeah, go into it with your eyes open, right? Don't just like sort of be the bag holder for the meme, but pay attention to what's happening here.
Yeah, well, I think this is a broader lesson. I mean, probably virtually all of our listeners will be invested in Bitcoin to some extent. And my guess is virtually all of you did a lot of learning about Bitcoin before you invested, right? It's not easy to understand Bitcoin, as we were talking about earlier. And then when you get it, you get it. And that was what gave you the comfort to allocate heavily. And I just think that like it's important to keep that lesson in mind. And whenever you allocate heavily to anything, at the very least, make sure like you really understand it.
Fantastic warning. Thanks, Zach. Stay humble, stack sats, right? Yeah, I think, to tie a bow around all this, right? We discussed a bunch of things today, and all of which, sort of have the potential to accelerate us further, down the, Bitcoin, geopolitical sort of importance. And I think all these factors, right, to some extent have the potential to increase Bitcoin's importance on the world stage, even if it's as small as, buying a zombie company and putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet. So yeah, good chat. Thanks guys. And we'll see everyone next week.